Hello, we have another art history lesson for you today. Our subjects today are three artists working around the exact same time in three different countries. So we have here from the roughly late 1700s to the turn of the 1800s works by Goya. That is Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808, in the top left corner. Beneath that, we have Turner, the Slave Ship. And the painting on the right is The Death of Marat by David, spelled David, pronounced David. So we have artists working in Spain, England, and France today. Let's start with Goya. Goya is from Spain. Last time we talked about Velázquez in the Baroque period. And Velázquez was the court painter for the King of Spain. That is, he lived at the palace in Madrid with the royal family, and his job was to paint whatever portraits the royal family wanted. And if you remember, though, also turned his eye to those who were less fortunate and began painting portraits of peasants and did his best to make art about people other than the super rich people who could afford to make paintings. Today, all three of these artists you're going to see are deeply political artists who are trying to advocate for social change and tackling social issues in their art in really powerful, difficult to view ways sometimes, paintings that can be pretty abrasive. And you have to start with Goya for that. We'll come back to the 3rd of May, 1808 in a few moments. There is Goya, by the way, in a self-portrait here, almost dressed in like a matador, Spanish matador here, holding his paintbrushes and leaning up against a canvas there on the wall. Now, to understand a little bit of the time frame going into Goya here, you need to understand what art was like in much of the 1700s. Remember, we talked about Velázquez last time, and he was living in the early to mid 1600s. So we've jumped ahead 100 plus years in time here. So what's actually happened? Well, there's an art movement called the Rococo, if you've ever heard that word. And this is not by Goya here. This is typical Rococo painting, though. After the Baroque period, we have this long period, which is basically most of the 1700s, the same time as a movement we call the Enlightenment in the sciences and in literature as well. You have in art, it's the equivalent of pop music in art, right? It's art light. It doesn't really tackle a lot of deep issues. Most of the time, it is these kind of overly frilly paintings of people enjoying life, right? So here we have this woman in this enormous gown here, just full of details. Lots of the scenes will contain garden scenes. Okay, in this case, we have people, in their best clothes, frolicking in the garden here. Cupids flying up above. Scenes of love and delight is what they're designed to show. All painted with pastel kind of colors. These are the popular paintings of the time. And for most of the 1700s, this is the kind of work that was being made. Now, of course, there are artists out there doing other kinds of art as well, pushing the boundaries. But this is the predominant form of art. It's an art that, I will be honest, I have a difficult time appreciating. In fact, I find it a little bit nauseating, to be honest with you. This is a piece by a French artist named Watteau here. Probably the most famous Rococo image, the swing. If you see this woman swings here, and she kicks her shoe off to her suitor who's lying down there beneath, hiding in the bushes, even as her boyfriend here is on the other side, giving her the push on the swing. So, this is a somewhat scandalous image here. But, it doesn't really say much. It's beautifully painted, but it's not the stuff of deep art that really challenges how you think or changes the way that you see the world. And so that's the world where our artists are kind of finding themselves. That's the dominant art form of the time. So just keep that in mind today. They're all kind of coming out of the Rococo period here in the late 1700s. So this is a work by Goya. And you can see that it shares some of the pastel colors here. Here we have a family out on a walk here in the countryside, and this is the kind of Rococo stuff that would have been popular at the time. So, mother has a sash here where she takes the flowers that the daughters are picking and puts them in her sash to collect them. And here's dad behind telling us, shh, don't tell her here. He's caught a hare and I don't know what's he going to do, surprise her with a bunny rabbit. I mean, it's light, frilly stuff, not about giving you deep stuff to think about here. This is the popular painting at the time. And so that's where Goya begins. And he has other paintings that fall along these lines as well. Figures in nature, pastel colors. Portraits as well. Here's a portrait of a wealthy Madrid citizen. Her name was Maya. She was famous for having these incredibly small feet. And so you can see her here staring straight forward, pointing at her feet, like, check these out, right? She looks at us here. So he is also the official court painter of Spain, 150 years after Velázquez. But he's very aware of Velázquez. He knows about the history of Spanish people, and he's a proud Spaniard. This is a fantastic painting to show you a little bit of Goya's mindset. Goya is he's definitely not the easiest person to get along with. I mean, he's an extremely talented painter, but he's someone who just can't really put up with other people's with injustice or with any sort of thing that he considers wrong. He has a difficult time being the court painter, I think, because he sees how they live at the palace in direct contrast to everybody who's living outside, at a time when most people are dirt poor peasants and you have the wealthy elite making all the decisions. Remember, I think I said last time too, that after many, many centuries of inbreeding, basically first cousins marrying first cousins, a lot of these countries in Europe now are being led by people who are not mentally fit to rule. Case in point, the king right here. This is King Charles of Spain here. He's the man in black with this just ridiculous amounts of medals pinned to his uniform there. And if you look close at him, he appears somewhat dim-witted. He's got kind of a far-off look in his eye. And if you look at most of the royal family here in this portrait, they have the same kind of look too. They definitely appear, as royals, but they all sort of look a little bit strange and a little bit off. And then way back there in the shadows off to the left, standing behind the edge of the canvas there, is Goya in the shadows, paints himself into the picture. And he's leering out at us as if to say, look what I have to deal with. Look at these crazy people. These were challenging times. War was on the horizon. You had a king who was glorifying that war, and there was a lot of fear about what might happen in Spain. And indeed, bad things did happen. We'll get to that in a moment. Goya is a person who used art as a way to deal with his own frustrations and his own thoughts about things as well. And what's fascinating about him is that he made lots of these pieces of art not to be seen by others, but really just for himself. So these are prints, actually. He made these images in order to be printed and circulated, but not very many copies were run, and not very many people saw them in his lifetime. The first major set of prints he made are called the Capriccios, and they're these scenes right here. And they're these strange allegorical scenes of figures, and I guess they're meant to deal with kind of the oncoming paranoia about the state of the world at the time, and maybe his fears about things. And so you have scenes like this is probably the most famous scene from the Capriccios here of this poet who's fallen asleep at his table there. And you can see a quote in Spanish down there on the edge of the table. The quote is the name of the piece, which is "The sleep of reason produces monsters." The sleep of reason produces monsters. So this poet here in his thinking and his reasoning has fallen asleep, and now he's having nightmares as personified by these owls and bats and even this weird lynx-type creature there in the bottom corner. Consider all we've seen so far. I mean, this is highly imaginative, really outside-the-box type art. Lots of the figures in the Capriccios fall along this line here where you have these two faceless figures kind of kidnapping this woman, and oftentimes he'll put a quote at the bottom that says "What a tragedy" or "How could this happen?" Right? They're all kind of cleverly titled as well. Now he made these again, as a way to deal with his own reaction to the world and the difficulties he was having with the oncoming madness. So let's talk about 1808. The name of the piece I said for him is the 3rd of May, 1808. This is a piece called the 2nd of May, 1808. And the 2nd of May, 1808, an event happened in Madrid. French troops came into Spain. They came to negotiate a surrender because Napoleon, Emperor Napoleon, is now Emperor of France. And Napoleon, without trying to get into too much really complicated history today, he basically just stormed throughout all of Europe and conquered most of it. Anyway, his troops arrive in Madrid in order to try to negotiate a surrender. And while some of the troops are inside, some others get into a clash with some Spanish civilians out on the plaza. Somebody throws a rock. A gun is fired, and pretty soon there is a melee going on here. So if you look at this image, which is no doubt exaggerated, you have everybody, in this fierce battle. We have this French troop who's actually been stabbed, and he's still stuck in the stirrups of his horse. You have people raising their swords up. You have a dead man there on the ground. In other words, this is the melee that happened. When it was done, a few French troops had died. Some Spanish civilians had fled off into the streets of Madrid, and there were swift repercussions. So that night, in the early morning hours of the 3rd of May, 1808, and this was a real event that happened, although exaggerated here, the French troops went out into the neighborhood, rounded up all the people who they thought were present at this melee, marched them to the outskirts of town against this huge rock, lined them up, and executed them to send a swift message that you're not going to mess with France. And many more people were killed than would have actually been at the actual melee. So, there's quite a bit of injustice going on here, certainly innocent people who are being killed. So when you look at an image like this is just a masterpiece of how to create an image that, in pretty much every single visual way, tells you exactly what the artist feels about this scene. So let's break it down here. Study it closely while I'm talking about it here. We have the Spanish troops on the left side, the French troops or Spanish civilians on the left, the French troops on the right. Let's compare the two groups of people. What's different about them? Well, first of all, the French, if you look, you can't see any of their faces. Their faces are all turned away. They're basically cold, impersonal troops. Whereas you see every single face of the Spanish people, including the poor guy who's already been shot, whose head is turned out towards us in gruesome way here. They're cradling their hands, cradling their faces in their hands, and they're crying, and they're weeping, and they're wailing, and they're pleading for mercy, where he doesn't even dignify the French troops with faces. Look at the body positions. The French troops are all lined up in the exact same way, almost like they're just a bunch of robots, right, holding their weapons here, whereas a real geometric shapes to their body, angles, hard angles. And you look at the Spanish troops, and they're all rounded and very organic and all very different. Kind of cold blues, grays, browns for the French troops. And if you look at the Spanish, every single one of them is different, right? Bright colors, obviously from the blood, but different colors to their clothing. So there is an impersonality and a harshness and a cruelty to the French here, pretty much in every single way that he shows them here, that is opposite from the Spanish. So there can kind of be no side, or no doubt as to whose side Goya is on here. And then, of course, we have the central character, who's this guy wearing this blazing white shirt with no shadows, almost like it's a light bulb. You might notice he holds his hands out. Hopefully that would remind you of a sacrificial or a Christ-like pose. Think of a crucifix, right, with hands out. Again, what's he saying? This man is pure, he's blameless, he's innocent, and he's about to lose his life in this gruesome way. He also exaggerates the brutality of the execution by putting the troops way closer to the victims as they would normally be. Normally they'd shoot from a long ways away, but their bayonets on the edge of their guns are almost touching this man here. So finally, you might notice the shape of this rock. So follow the shape of the rock from the top left corner down, and you see it kind of curves around where it meets the French troops and then goes back out at the very base, almost like a large, dark mouth kind of closing in, almost like the darkness is swallowing the light. Those are just a few things I can point out here, and we could keep going, but basically, this is a piece of pro-Spanish propaganda here. Goya is deeply wounded and hurt by this event that's starting a war now between France and Spain, a war that's going to have awful consequences for the country he loves. And there can be no doubt, as to whose side he's on here. He is fiercely Spanish, and he hates the French. Now, some of these images I'm going to flip through here in a moment, I will just warn you, are kind of gruesome. But what's fascinating here, this is art that's 200 years old now. This is Goya's way of dealing with the harshness and brutality of the world. He creates another series of prints, at this time, now that this war has begun between France and Spain. They're called the Horrors of War series, the Horrors of War. When the Iraq War happened 15 years ago now, there were journalists who went to Iraq. And this happens in every war nowadays, but there are journalists who will go on the ground and attempt to take pictures of the civilian cost of how awful it is. Because if you only trust what tends to come through the TV and come from the higher ups, they're not going to show you the gruesome stuff. They don't want the people who are supporting the war at home to know the real cost of what dropping bombs means, or the real cost in civilian casualties and lives. And so you don't see that stuff. And the point of journalists is to get on the ground and actually show you what's happening. So I'm telling you that because I think that's similar to what Goya is doing here. I think he's trying hard to tell the truth, even though it's exaggerated. So here we have in one of his scenes from the Horrors of War here, a Spanish civilian who's been hung on a tree, and you can see beyond that his pants have been pulled down. And then you have this French troop leaning back, smiling here, looking up at him, almost like he's happy, with the job that he's done. Again, Goya is fiercely Spanish, but he's also going out of his way to, show us that war is not something to be glorified. It's something that's horrible. And I'll flip through these quickly because even after 200 years, they're shockingly gruesome. Scenes of people killing each other, of maimed bodies. We'll let that one speak for itself. Dismembered corpses. So Goya, as a result, fiercely anti-war, was dismissed from being the court painter because, of course, the king considers war, this glorious thing that all men are supposed to do. Go give your lives for Spain. Saw that Goya, hating the war, dismissed him. And so you can kind of track Goya's mental state as he's, trying to deal with his world turned upside down in that way. This is a painting that's owned by the Minneapolis Institute, so if you ever get over there, you can see it, which is kind of cool. It's called the Self-Portrait with Dr. Arrieta. Goya suffered some illness and was on the brink of death before he was nursed back to health. So here he is, ashen white in this bed with his doctor holding his head, preparing to give him a drink here of some sort of elixir or tonic. And then it actually has a note inscribed on the bottom of the painting, painted on the painting, that basically thanks Dr. Arrieta for nursing him back to health. Around this time, he also went deaf and kind of descended into madness. And this is what fascinates art historians so much about Goya. Towards the end of his life, was exiled, of all places, to France, rural France, where he holed himself up in this house and, as an old man, basically living by himself in this house. Deaf now, just imagine, what that would be like if you lived by yourself in a world of complete silence, and no way to deal with this insane creativity he has in his head. He starts painting the walls in his house. And today the house is no more. They've removed those big paintings that he made right on the walls in the house. purely for his own creative output. I think he wasn't making them to ever be seen by anybody, but now they've been removed and placed into museums as huge paintings. But this one here, this enormous panoramic scene from his hallway called The Witch's Sabbath, and it has just these crazy and dark, bleak colors here, these twisted, almost melting plastic type faces here. And this large mythological goat-headed figure here. What is he thinking? What's he trying to do? Well, again, he's somewhat tortured by darkness, by his own creativity and his lack of being able to hear. I'm about to show you one of the absolute over-the-top crazy images in all of art history. And this was painted by Goya in his dining room. So just imagine, check this painting out right here. This painting is what you are going to sit and look at as you are eating your food. This is called Saturn eating his children. Saturn eating his children. And it's an awful image to look at. Even today, 200 years later, it turns our stomachs to look at it. And it's one that I actually enjoy talking about, because as I talk about it, I can look out at students and see them having trouble looking at the screen. Maybe you're perhaps having that trouble right now. What in the world is going on here? Well, to actually break it down, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. The myth of Saturn from mythology is that Saturn, here's the quick version of it, Saturn is foretold by an oracle that one of his children is going to grow up and overthrow him. And so as he has children, he takes every single one of the babies and he devours them. He's paranoid, sick with fear that one of his children is going to grow up and overthrow him. So to make sure that doesn't happen, he eats all of his children until finally his wife wises up and realizes what's happening. And so instead of giving him a baby, she gives him a stone, and he eats the stone. And the baby goes away and grows up and then comes back and actually does succeed in overthrowing Saturn. So just a weird mythological story. But what significance does it have for Goya? Think of Spain. Think of the Spanish government. Basically, for its own vainglory, for its own purposes of trying to protect itself and make sure that its power is preserved, is completely willing to just send generation of young men off to their deaths in a meaningless war just for itself, purely selfish purposes. That fits perfectly. I mean, it's a metaphor for Spain and for his deep anguish at the way that his country is just destroying itself with so little regard for life. Beyond that, just consider all that we've looked at before, just how crazy this image is. I mean, look at his leg and his arm. It almost appears like he's made of melting plastic, too. Very strange. Finally, he painted this in his house as well. This is called the Colossus. And if you look down at the bottom there, you have cattle, you have people fleeing in their wagons with all of their possessions against this enormous giant, so large he's way over the side of the horizon there. No one's going to get in his way, stomping over the land. So again, a metaphor here. Who's the giant in Goya's world? It's Napoleon. It's Emperor Napoleon of France, who's basically walking across Europe, just destroying growing his empire, conquering all of Europe and taking it over. And so, he's the Colossus. Anyway, Goya, incredibly creative, but a dark, twisted guy who, certainly underappreciated in his time, but is now seen, as doing things, a century before his time in terms of just crazy, outside-the-box creativity, and also embracing the dark, really difficult realities of life. All right, so that's Goya. The next one is Turner, Turner. The name of this piece is called The Slave Ship. We'll come back to that in a moment. There is Turner, by the way, Joseph Mallard William Turner. So he is British. We haven't talked about Britain yet, but there is an art tradition in Britain as well. So from Spain to Britain. In Britain, there's a Rococo as well, although there's a great tradition in Britain of landscape painting. This is an earlier Turner work. And really what you have to imagine is, this is way before, obviously, a century and a half before TV and mass communication like we have today. So if you want to go to a far-off place like Venice, which is what you see here, Venice, Italy, you either have to, you have to travel there or read about it in a book, or now you can go to see one of these amazing paintings painted by Turner and feel like you are there. People used to look at these paintings with spy glasses, basically, to feel like they were getting a view into a portal into another place, a far-off place that they'd always heard about but wouldn't get to visit. And so the whole point of it is to try to paint as realistically as possible. Every little rope in the rigging on those ships, every little wave, every step, every column, the exact color of the sky on the warm summer day. Everything about it is supposed to be as perfect as possible. That's the tradition in landscape painting in Britain, and that's how you're supposed to paint. So Turner, what he does is he goes to Venice as a young man, spends a lot of time there, and there's actually a great treasury of Turner watercolor paintings, actually. Watercolor we haven't talked about at all, but watercolor would have never been actually shown to anybody else. Instead, this is what artists do in the day. They go out with their sketch pad and watercolor paints and try to capture the hazy yellow of an afternoon sun like you're seeing here on a hot day, and then you take that back to the studio in order to make a larger oil painting. So that's what Turner's doing, and that's what he's been trained to do. And he is quite successful in Britain as a landscape painter. He's sort of the greatest landscape painter of his day. A lot of them have allegories and tell bigger meanings. It's never just a picture of a ship, in this case, or of a landscape. It always tends to mean something bigger, or there's something to be broken down. Just for sake of time, we'll go quickly here, but I can break this one down. The other thing happening in Britain at this time is the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And so you've got places like London and Paris are really some of the most disgusting, awful places in the world to live in terms of pollution now, because you're starting to get machines, right? Coal-powered machines taking over manufacturing and day-to-day tasks. So in this case, we're standing here looking out at the ocean, and we've got a sunset going down beyond us here. But we have a grand clipper ship, a giant white clipper ship. England has is known for having the world's greatest navy for a very long time. But it's being towed into harbor to be dismantled because this was the time when they were taking apart all those old ships and replacing them with coal-powered steamers. So you have this dark steamer here who's hauling it into harbor here, belching out disgusting pollution there out of the smokestack. One of the things about pollution in the air, and this is something we've learning here in America now that we have so many wildfires, is that it does make for beautiful sunsets. You get all that smoke up in the sky. There's little particulates of smoke everywhere. When the sun goes down, it hits that and lights it up, brightly colored here. So we actually have this sort of pollution sunset here on the other side of the picture. So, he's raising a question here. It's not just a picture of a pretty ship here in harbor. He's raising a question about industry and about pollution and about maybe this old world with this beautifully crafted white clipper ship here being replaced. And what are we replacing the craftsmanship and care that we gave to things in the past with? And what's this new world going to be like? A lot of his paintings, though, veer into very strange territory. I mean, this is, again, early 1800s, and it's almost an abstract painting. Turner lived by the ocean. He was keenly aware of what fog looked like and what water looked like. And so you look at these paintings now, and they appear to be really abstract, but actually they're very close to what it looks like to look out, on a super foggy day when the tide has gone out. Here he's attempting to paint a storm at sea. You can actually see some birds flying away from this storm, and you get the sense of this big churning in the ocean, even as it's almost completely an abstract picture. Very odd, very strange. Again, if there's a theme to these artists today, it's that they're painting pretty far ahead of their time. Here's the burning of the Houses of Parliament, a famous tragic fire that happened in London at the time. And again, almost an abstract painting until you look close and realize There are details in there. There's the bridge. There's little people gathering on the opposite shore, fleeing across the river. I love this one. Here's one of his watercolors here of the tide's gone out. We have the hazy moon and just the shadow of this dog here on the beach. So let's talk about the slave ship. These are difficult things to talk about, but again, art is an amazing tool for engaging with the difficult parts of the world that are hard to understand, commenting on it, advocating for change. One of the big social issues in Britain at the time is the abolitionist movement. Britain, actually the first country to abolish the slave trade long before the Spanish and the Portuguese did. The slave trade, of course, taking captive Africans from West Africa to the New World in exchange for tobacco and other products, and is very lucrative. And Britain, has made the decision to get out of that, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a huge social movement that happened to finally say we're not going to be a part of this anymore. This is the same time when the hymn "Amazing Grace" is written. You may have heard the story that the writer of Amazing Grace was a former slave trader. So when he's writing the words, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," that is what he's talking about, right? Deep guilt and hurt over knowing what he's done and the cruelty of the slave trade, but also knowing that he's saved, that is the power of grace. I mean, it just adds to the power of those particular words. Well, that's happening at the same time, and this is definitely part of it. And one major cultural event that happened to kind of tip the scales in the favor of the abolitionist movement in Britain was a highly publicized newspaper article about insurance fraud. This is the kind of thing that happens now as it happened then, but because slaves were considered cargo and not actual people, you could get an insurance policy. So if you're halfway across the Atlantic Ocean on a perilous voyage and all of a sudden there's a storm and you've got barrels of fruit or something and it gets salt water all over it and it gets destroyed, you're not going to lose your business, right? You can buy an insurance policy. And people were doing the same thing with their slaves. And what would happen is they would treat them so poorly and so badly that oftentimes, if a majority of them had died, they would turn back halfway along the voyage, simply dumping their cargo overboard, the dead bodies, but also the live bodies as well, chained together, shackled together. And these insurance fraud schemes started coming out, and it just it pushed public sentiment to the point where the slave trade was abolished. Difficult things to hear, but this is the truth and the horror of our history. Look closely at this, what appears to just be a beautiful sunset. Again, he draws you in with this bright, beautiful, inviting, just really beautiful layering of color. But you'll see here down in the waves, which are this sickly green kind of color, if you look close, there are hands reaching up with shackles on them. There's these almost cartoonish piranha-type fish. There are swirls of red in the water, either of blood or maybe a foretelling of something that has happened here. And then you see the clipper ship there turning into the wind away towards the storm that's coming, right? That's the storm of social change here. So, this is, it's an image that people walk right by today. If you ever go to Boston, to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, you can see it there. It's a really beautiful image, and people are like, oh, that's a pretty boat. That's a pretty sunset. And then they just don't look very close. I mean, Turner is taking on an enormously ugly, awful event here, and doing it in a way that pulls us in and confronts us and asks us what we're going to do about it and what we really believe about it. It's a really powerful image. Turner was seen in his later days as something of a crazy person for painting pictures like this, paintings that were increasingly abstract. And when he died, there were hundreds of paintings in his studio. Today, he's seen as being light years ahead of his time and really pushing the boundaries of social issues in his art, but also the way the paintings are painted, certainly way ahead of his time. All right, last one here, David. So we've talked about Spanish art, we've talked about some British art today, and now we're going to talk about some French art. David is spelled David, by the way. The name of this piece is The Death of Marat. You can see a Marat there, and then you can see he's written his own name there, David. We'll come back to this piece in a moment. There is David. David is part of Jacques-Louis David is his name, by the way. And David is also coming out of this, all three of these artists living at the same time. Although he's very much pro-French and pro-Napoleon, so we're going to see that as well. But a talented young painter. And this is the Rococo work of the time, right? Very much where David is starting and coming out from. Again, the frilly garden scenes, the bright pastel colors, the Cupids firing their arrows here. This is the popular work of the time. But eventually that begins to change. And this is the time, the years leading up to the French Revolution. And so these are like really significant, important days in France where huge societal changes are happening. One of the movements that's happening at this time is called neoclassicism. Neoclassicism. So neo meaning new and classicism meaning of the classics. So the new classics, basically artists who are looking back again to Roman art, to Greek art, to the great stories, myths, legends of the past, and recreating them in a new way. And what it's saying here basically is, since this is very, very French art, it's kind of putting France, in this case, on equal footing with ancient Rome and ancient Greece as, a great civilization in the world. That's a huge part behind neoclassicism. This called The Oath of the Horatii, a very famous David painting here. Here, depicting this Roman legend, there's going to be a huge battle here, and the two sides realize thousands and thousands of soldiers are going to die in this battle. Maybe it would be better, instead of killing everyone, if we just, each side selects three of their best fighters to go off to their deaths and fight to the death instead of sending the whole army off to their death. And these three brothers, the Horatii, vowed that they will go in service of everyone and that they will fight. So here they are holding their hands out, about to take these swords. You can see their wives and their children crying, knowing that their husbands are about to go off to basically give their lives for everybody else. So, again, a powerful painting about bravery, about giving your life for others, and also painted in a very stark, classical way. Notice how there's a lot of primary colors, so it's kind of red, blues, golds, and a lot of just strong light, very realistically painted as well. Here's another one, The Death of Socrates. Socrates, according to tradition, drank hemlock and chose suicide over death. Here his followers are, he's accused of poisoning the minds of the youth of Athens. So his followers here are all crying and weeping and wailing, and he's pointing upwards, saying, reason will endure, reason will survive. I may not be with you, but our cause is just, as he's reaching for the goblet here, of hemlock to kill himself. So, these are powerful symbols, statements to people in France in revolutionary years. Here's a painting called The Oath on the Tennis Court. And, so leading up to the French Revolution, the overthrow of the monarchy, the feeling that, people are sick to death of having wealthy kings and queens in their gigantic palaces. It's not a government for the people. And certainly, America now is a new nation, and there have been other revolutions as well, and France is gearing up for war. And so here you have revolutionaries all coming together, drafting documents, talking about, this new nation they're going to create, holding up their hands as if to say, yes, we're with you. And so David is very much an artist of the revolution. He's painting for revolutionary causes, and that's what he cares about. So the death of Marat here, Marat is a revolutionary leader, and this is an event that actually happened. He was a friend of David's, but he had a very painful skin affliction, and so he had to take baths daily in order to soak his skin and find some relief. So here he is sitting in his bath. And one day he's writing a letter, a table that he would put over top of his bath so he could dictate his notes and his letters. He's sitting in his bath, and assassin comes in. A woman came into his house and stabbed him in his tub, and he bled to death in his tub here. And so here's, this is basically a eulogy for his friend, right? Death, shown here, as he's writing on his letters there about revolution. The pen falls to the ground here, the knife on the ground, and Marat has passed away. Half the picture is just dark black bleakness up above. But this was a painting meant to, memorialize a revolutionary hero at the time in France. So France goes into revolution, and it's a crazy, violent time. Other neoclassical paintings painted at this time. The intervention of the Sabian here. So, again, themes from old myths that are made new. We have from this myth here, you can see the women intervening the men as they're about to kill each other. The women and the children intervene and ask for peace. I mean, these are incredibly violent times in France. So eventually, as a result of all of that, Napoleon ends up coming to power. Here's Napoleon. So some of the most famous pictures of Napoleon were painted by David. Here he is, in this incredibly realistic portrait, looking out at us here, with his royal throne and his sword there off to the side. And we've talked about him earlier today and what he did as a result of becoming the emperor and how he conquered much of Europe in the process. Here's the coronation of Emperor Napoleon here, a scene that, is probably pretty realistic to what happened here. An enormous procession in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, where he was crowned this kind of new emperor of France, basically. And a very famous image of David's here of Napoleon charging up the Alps. So, this is, again, a propaganda picture, just the way that Goya's pictures are propaganda for Spain in a lot of ways. There could be no doubt as to who he supports. But here, Napoleon rears up on his horse, pointing up the Alps here. So if you look down at the bottom there, you can see it says Bonaparte, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, following in the steps of Hannibal and the great emperors of the old who went up over top of the Alps and then stormed down the other side, did this impossible task. You can see the soldiers in the distance there pointing, pushing cannons and heavy artillery up the straight up the mountainside here as Napoleon rears up on his horse and looks out at us. I mean, this is totally heroic, over the top, pro-French propaganda, and that's very much who where David's political opinions lie. But there can be no doubt that he's painting in a really strong, graphic way that feels very much, it's this neoclassical way, right? Even as he's painting Napoleon, he's trying to cast Napoleon as one of the great emperors, of ancient times. So eventually Napoleon is defeated and goes into exile as well. So those who were loyal to him also get exiled and sent away from France. And so David actually moves to Brussels, and that's where he spends the remainder of his days in exile in Brussels. But anyway, super powerful painting, again, based around political, in this case, political upheaval in France. So if there's anything to take from today, it's that art can have a political bent. It can tell a story. It can betray a position on a social issue, on a justice issue, on political issues. We're seeing art being used in all of those ways, not just commissioned portraits of people or pictures of biblical scenes made for churches. Now art, can be really powerful in its own way. Thanks for paying attention, and goodbye.